This is the final episode in our latest season, covering unsolved homicides across the United States, and the second in a two-part series. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are solely the interviewee's own. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This series discusses crime scenes, violence, and homicide. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. Last time on The Fall Line, we began the story of Rose Goodman, a Southwest Philadelphia mother and grandmother who was shot and killed in her home in September of 2023. Rose, who was 80, had lived on Broomall Street for 50 years with her husband Butch, who passed away in 2021. When her daughter Donna couldn't reach her on September 7th, the family grew concerned. Rose's 3 adult children, Devin, Alan, and Donna, had been working to transition their mother's care, knowing that she felt safest in her longtime home, surrounded by her strong community network. After the family couldn't reach Rose, a cousin and a neighbor entered the house during a wellness check, and they found Rose collapsed upstairs. Initially assuming a medical emergency, they began CPR and called emergency services. Only later did investigators discover someone had broken in through a secured basement window and shot Rose once in the chest. Though Philadelphia PD have been hard at work on the case, no one has been arrested in Rose's murder to date, and authorities and Rose's family need your help bringing in tips and leads. In our last episode, we spoke with Rose's middle child, her son Alan, and her youngest daughter, Donna, about their parents and their lives. When we left off, they were describing their mother's transition into widowhood and the family's growing concern about her life alone in their childhood home. Though Rose had a strong network made up of local family, neighbors, friends, and church members who were ready to help, her 3 adult children and her grandchildren were working toward moving Rose to residence with Alan's family in Wisconsin. His oldest brother, Devin, drove in regularly from New Jersey to help their mother, and Donna, who was living farther away by that point, was in daily contact as well. The 3 had been primarily concerned about their mother's trips to the bank and the grocery store, and her solo drives around Philadelphia. What they hadn't worried about was her safety in the home on Broomall Street, where they'd all grown up. The block was still close-knit, despite a few long-term residents, like their next-door neighbor, moving away. Alan told us that growing gun violence in the city had not affected their block up until that point, and that the small community kept a close watch on one another. In fact, their across-the-street neighbor Ted was always there to help Rose with tasks around the house. They'd all grown up together. It was the kind of things that they would have done for any elder. Rose had a strong, secure front door, but no alarm system. Alan told us they had discussed it, but Rose didn't feel comfortable with technology. That had been Butch's area, and she wasn't comfortable with the complexity that such a system would entail. She had plenty of locks, though, and break-ins were not common on Broomall Street. Or they hadn't been. Not until Rose's own house was the target. It was an event that shook the entire block. Rose was beloved by everyone on Broomall, and by the larger community where she'd volunteered for decades. When we sat down with Alan and Donna to speak about their mother's case, we asked them to tell us whether there'd been any signs of criminal activity in the area, and if anyone strange had approached Rose.
So when you spoke to her, she didn't mention anything like seeing anyone unusual. She didn't mention strange phone calls, nothing that sort of raised your radar when you guys spoke.
No, not at the time, but I will say my mom would probably give different details to like my sister when she talked to her or my brother. Like we would each get like a different part of a story in some cases, which again, I think goes back to memory. So a couple things were interesting. So one is that I mentioned that our previous neighbor didn't own the house. And so when he moved out, we assumed the house would be up for sale, but it wasn't because he had a landlord, which we didn't know. And so the landlord decided to renovate the house. They were renovating the house and they were really working on the house at odd hours. It's like early in the morning, late at night. And so my mom was awake, and even though she stayed up late, it was still a lot of noise, apparently. Now, I never heard any of this when I was visiting. And so she had complained about it, as my sister was telling me. She had actually called the police because they just kept working anyway. And the police came by and found out that they were using unlicensed contractors to renovate the house. I did mention this to the police. That raised an antenna for me after the fact because I'm like, okay, that's interesting. You know, the other thing was there was a guy that came by that our neighbor's son, Ted, knew because Ted would do some work at the house. And sometimes he'd ask like some people he knew to help. This guy kept coming by and asking if he could do work. And my mom was like, no, I'm fine. I don't need any more work done. He's like, no, you sure? She's like, no, I'm fine. Apparently he had done some work on the roof with Ted and some other people. But the guy kept coming. He came by a couple other times trying to get my mom to give him some work. Those are just two things. I don't know if they're connected or not, but those things after the fact raise an eyebrow for me. Had I known them prior, probably would have done something a little different.
Alan wants to make it clear that Ted, their neighbor, was a longtime friend to their family and was one of the people who rushed to Rose's home during the wellness check, and not at all a possible person of interest in this case. Ted did not encourage this other man to stop by Rose's home again to look for work, and he had not known about those visits.
So you and your siblings had to kind of all put it together.
Yep, absolutely.
One thing that bothers me is that when I was in town July, she thought she heard noise outside of the air conditioner. She thought she heard someone out there. And with me being afraid of everything, I said, well, I'm not lifting that up to see what's going on the other side. And it just makes me wonder to this day, was that the person, digging or picking at, underneath the air conditioner, trying to get into that window? What was she hearing?
By window, Donna's referring to that secured basement window, which is how the intruder eventually made it into Rose's home. It would have taken time to figure out that access point and to actually break in. But Rose's children believe that the intruder had been watching the house for some time and deciding on the best way to enter. What precisely this person was after, they still don't know. Though they put together bits of information after her death that, together, created some concern, none of them had the full picture in September of 2023. Alan told us that each of them had spoken to their mother at various times that week. At least one of them was in contact every single day to make sure that things were well. That's how they were able to identify quickly that something was wrong.
So that morning of the 7th, my sister sent a text out to my brother and I and said, hey, have you heard from mom? I think it was maybe late morning. And my brother said, yep, I talked to her last night. And I said, I talked to her the day before. And my sister's like, hey, my sister calls her every morning. And she's like, yeah, well, I called her this morning. She didn't answer. I called her a couple of times. She didn't answer. But we had a neighbor, Ted, who's across the street. And we're like, hey, let's get Ted to go over and knock on the door. Ted goes over, knocks on the door, bangs on the door, no answer. So now we're like, okay, what's happening? And so my sister indicates hey, over the last month, mom has fallen a couple times. So we're thinking maybe she fell and she couldn't get to the phone, couldn't get to the door. So we call our cousin Jean Peterson. She's the one who's a nurse, and she has a key to the house. And so she was coming over to go in the house. Ted basically said, hey, I don't want you to go in the house by yourself because I don't know what we're going to find. Right. So he said, so let's go in together. So they go in and they don't notice the basement door being knocked over because you go in the house and it's like a enclosed porch. And then you walk through some doors into the living room. There's a dining room, and then there's a kitchen where the basement entrance is. So you would have had to have been looking for a break-in to notice that. Right? Because the lights were out too. So they turn that one light on and they're calling my mom's name, no response. So they go upstairs. And as they turn the corner upstairs, they turn a light on and they see my mom laying in her bedroom. And so our cousin Jean immediately, as a nurse, she goes into CPR, right? And they noticed that it was hot in the room, and they thought that she had just fainted or something because her body was still warm. But in reality, there was something going on with the air conditioner. And it was a hot day that day. And so, obviously tried to revive her, not knowing at the time that she had already passed. And so my cousin, she calls me and, they called the police, but then she called me like hysterical, like your mom's, Rose is dead. And I think she may have called my brother first because he's closer. And so my brother gets in the car, starts driving over. She tells me that, and then the police come. Now, what they don't notice is that there was blood. I think she thought what we all thought was that she maybe got faint, fell, hit her head. That's what we all thought, right? Because, she just went to CPR. She didn't really examine her clothes or anything. And so that's what we thought, right? So police came, they're doing their investigation. My brother gets there and they're not allowing anybody in the house. And so my brother goes across the street to our neighbor, Miss Betty, who's Ted's mother. So I call him, we're on the phone. He's like, hey, look, I'm just waiting to see what's happening here. Go to bed, try to get some sleep. I'll call you as soon as I know what's happened. And so, I kind of updated my sister, said, hey, Devin's there. Try to get some sleep. We'll figure this out. So I went to sleep thinking my mom fell, she hit her head. I didn't really sleep much, but I at least in the thought of my head was, okay, gosh, she missed dad. Obviously, we wouldn't want her to die this way, but it's understandable for an older person for this to happen. Like, okay, like let me just wrap my mind around this. And then about 4 o'clock Central Time, which is 5 o'clock Eastern Time, my brother calls me and he's driving home. And I said, hey, how are you, man? I know you're driving home. And he didn't really say anything. And I was like, man, so it must have been hot in there for mom to like hit her head. And he didn't say anything. And I was like, are you okay? And he said, that's not how she died. I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, somebody shot her. I'm like, what? And then he goes through, the guy, breaks in, comes upstairs. In that side room, my mom confronts him. I mentioned before that my mom's a fighter, right? So she's not just going to like cower in fear. She's going to say like, what are you doing in my house? Like, get out of my house. And so he shot her there in that room. And we know that because there's a hole in the wall. And then based on the way the room is, there's a bed when you come in and there's like this big chest. And so he had to maybe step or jump over her to get out of the house, and then ran out and tried to get out of the front door. He couldn't because it's like Fort Knox getting in there. So he had to essentially go back down the basement and back through that window. So again, he had to be skinny to get out of there. And he had gloves on, so he didn't leave any fingerprints. So I had to call my sister and tell her that. At that point, we were all just stunned. And I would say, as far as how this impacts families, I mean, you basically go into a fog almost. Like, I can't really tell you.
As we mentioned earlier, Alan said there had not been any reports of break-ins in their immediate area.
I think that's what made this so shocking, is that I don't know anybody who had a basement broken into. Now, I will say this. We went on vacation when we were younger, but we came back and somebody had broken into our house. And they had broken in through, I think, a window or the front door. And so that was the only time that we had experienced that. But as far as basements are concerned, basically, a lot of people had bars in front of their basement windows. And then in the back, there's like a metal door that you would have to lift to go down some steps to get into the basement. We would open it up, pull it up. This one was very similar, and I think all the neighborhoods have it.
So in terms of the point of entry there, do you have a clear understanding of how that happened?
Yes. So basically what happened, and some of this I didn't even get from the police. I just went and looked. From the front of the house, there's some steps like right next to the front of the house. There's some steps right up to the door, and like to the left on the other side, like the little yard in the front, there's some other steps that go into the alley. And so that area, right on the other side of the alley, there's an apartment building. It's on the corner, and it takes up from the corner all the way down to that alley next to our house. And so there were some weeds that were overgrown. And so they grew over and they were covering the alley entrance, right? And so the person who broke in went into the alley, and we have like a little gate. It's like a 3-foot high gate. Like you just open the gate and go in. It wasn't really security. So the person went in the alley, but first, before they tried to get into the house through those windows, they went to the back of the house and tried to get in through the kitchen window. And so you can see he tried to lift the kitchen window, both kitchen windows. He tried to get into the back door, couldn't do that. And so he really took his time, which is why it's important that those weeds were covering the entrance to the alley, because nobody would see him in the alley, which to me tells me that he's been there before. And so when he eventually couldn't get into the windows of the door, he went into looking at the 2 basement windows. Now, typically the basement window is like a solid, thick glass that you can't break. I think it's pretty thick, but it lets light in. And it may have like a little window there, like a screen. Well, one of those was not the glass. One of those was a thinner glass and then also had a screen. And so I had never noticed that. I'm not sure why that was like that. I have no idea. And so this person, they were wearing gloves, from my understanding, had tools with them, which tells me they've been there before. They unscrewed that, took it off, and then kicked in the thinner glass window. And it's fairly narrow, so this person was skinny. Climbed in through there, and then came up the basement steps and kicked in the door because it had a double lock on it. Kicked in that door. So that's how they got in, which was unusual because I don't think anybody else has had their basement broken into, which for me tells me that he's either been in the house before, maybe doing some work, or had spent some time just looking at the house and seeing potential ways in. And she would lock everything up. Like you weren't getting in the door. I think the person even tried the front door too, because tried to get in that way. And like, you're not getting in those doors. Like they're not moving. And so I think he had tried the front at one point. At least it looked like he did.
And to your understanding, were there any other attempted break-ins reported in that time frame in the area?
Not to my knowledge. I will say though that, so my mom had just turned 80. I do know that in that 2 weeks prior, there were 2 80-year-old people, I think both men. One person was, I think, attacked and shot on the street. Someone was trying to rob him. And then there was another 80-year-old who was also attacked or something leading up to this. I only found this out after I looked back on it. So basically, nothing was stolen, right? And so what we suspect was that when the person made his way upstairs, he made so much noise kicking the door in that my mom woke up. So I think it's roughly like 5 a.m., 4 a.m., 4:30, 5 a.m. When you look at the front of the house, that top window there is the master bedroom. And then there's a bathroom down the hall, and there's 2 other rooms down the hall. One is like right at the top of the steps. He was in that room when my mom sort of confronted him, and I think startled him. And so what the police think is that it startled him, and then he shot her, and then he got out of the house. He ran out. So there was nothing missing, at least that we found. But I do find it interesting that he was in the middle room, which tells me that maybe he was looking for something specific. There's a safe in there, but you need the combination to get in the safe. And you'd have to know it was in the closet behind clothes and all that. It gets back to, it had to be somebody who'd been in the house, because how would you know to go to that room? My dad did have some things like a coin collection that was like on the desk. Most of the stuff was like either in a drawer or in the safe itself. So maybe it was that, but I can't imagine, risking breaking into a home to steal a coin collection that may or may not have any value.
Donna was the first to alert her siblings that something was wrong because she'd been trying to get in touch with their mother. If you'll recall, Donna had shifted careers and gone into teaching, which was something Rose had always encouraged. And Rose was waiting to hear about how things were going. After no contact in the morning, Donna reached out again after a trying day at school.
We spoke every day, though. And that's how I ultimately was able to know that something was wrong. When I called this particular day, it was very unusual. I had had a great day at school the previous day, and this particular day was just the worst. They were having grits for grandparents or something like that. There was a student that was crying because her grandparent was gone. So I am sitting on a bench outside of my classroom crying with this little girl. So you have to think, the moment that this happened to my mother, I'm crying, right? And I see these people with clipboards and carts and cameras go into my classroom. So I'm a beginning teacher, and so we get observed. So I'm supposed to be observed, my teaching strategies, and I'm outside of the classroom on the bench crying with a child. So now I got to pull myself together, go in this classroom, and it just was a mess. It was horrible. And so as I'm driving, then I call my mom. And I'm like, oh, I know she's not out. We don't like her going out. And so it's getting later and later. And I'm texting, I'm calling. And by maybe 8:30, I'm like, I know something's wrong. And then I contacted my oldest brother. I didn't want to call her friends. I didn't want to worry or upset anybody, but I needed someone that I trusted to check it out, to see what was going on. And our concern was really about the heat. It was a really hot day in Philadelphia, and her air conditioning was out. We called someone to fix it when I was in town, and they had another project that they were working on. And so we were encouraging her to either sleep downstairs where it's nice and cool, or sleep in the back room. So that's what was really going through my mind. So I was planning to call her to tell her about this awful day I had in school. And so when I spoke with her friend that had spoken to her that very last time, we realized that it wasn't meant for my mom to know that I had this bad day at work. She left the earth knowing that I loved my job. It was great. It was the most wonderful thing in the world. And it has returned to that. But I just was not meant to tell her that I had this terrible day.
Like Alan, Donna got the news in pieces, and more context came in from officials. At first, she thought Rose had died of natural causes, and that was devastating on its own. Later, she had to hear about the investigators' findings and process it all over again.
Devin told me that Mom was gone, but I didn't really receive the information. He told me. And so I go to bed to get up and get ready for work the next day. But when I wake up, I have a text from Devin to call him right away, which is not like him at all. And so, I called him, and then he started telling me what happened. And I told him, I said, don't tell me anymore. I said, I'm on my way to work. I'm just going to push through today. And our assistant principal said, why are you here? I've called a sub. She's in the front office. I'll send her home if you want, but she's there. I'm not quite sure why you're here. And so, went in a room with her and just spoke with her, and then told her, I needed to be there. Children just have a way of keeping you busy, keeping your mind off of things, keeping you, grounded. I said, I just sort of want to finish up, and then, I'll take a week off. And so that's how I handled things. And then I requested just a few more days at the end of the month to fly home, bury my mom. So that was on a Thursday. We went to the house Friday. I'm back at work Monday, just, like nothing happened.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home. Mom, Dad, I'm not throwing shade, but the whole New Year's resolution thing, kind of slipping, no offense. Anyway, my best friend Jenny's dad, crushing it. He uses Blue Apron. He says he ordered 1-pan assemble and bake meals and these things called meal kits. They're all super easy to make. He keeps yelling, protein and fiber, baby. Also, the food, we tried it. So good. So maybe check it out or whatever. Blue Apron. Get $50 off your first 2 orders plus free shipping with code STIR50. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.
One thing that the Goodman family highlighted was the early and consistent communication they received from the Philadelphia Police Department. We were also in communication with officials in relation to these episodes, and while there was no on-record statement, we're confident that their detectives are dedicated to solving Rose's case. Based on what we've learned, the Goodman's children have been kept in the loop and were offered detailed information and victim services from the beginning.
I want to say we spoke to them besides that night. I want to say I spoke to them maybe within, I want to say it was the next day. I have a interesting history with police in that I don't have a record or anything like that, but I've had family members who are police officers, a very good friend here in Milwaukee who's the police chief, and also bad experiences with the police department. So I always have a healthy level of skepticism, at least initially, with police. And so the police they reached out. So they have like a liaison officer who reaches out and basically just said, hey, I'm so sorry. Here's what we know. Here's all of our contact information. Here's where you go for if you need therapy. Here's some initial stuff you're going to need. Here are the phone numbers of the detectives.
Alan told us that a retired member of law enforcement, who's an active member of Rose's church, has also been very supportive. In his own case, he said that he was able to stay in contact with law enforcement and focus on his mother's case because he did something for himself first. He set up grief counseling and therapy to help him process what he was and is going through, and that's helped him to keep focus.
I'm just not going to let it go. So that's just in my personality. I probably get that from my mom, just to fight. I know my brother did as well. He called the detective as well, kind of keeping in touch, just to see what was happening, as well as the officer that goes to the church and just trying to understand what's happening. What are they finding? They did do a pretty good job of keeping a open line of communication. As a matter of fact, on Mother's Day of that next year, so that'd be 2022, we had a rally in front of the house to bring attention back to it. It was covered by, I know, at least 2 of the local news stations. I want to say all 3, maybe. Police were there as well, as far as community residents. And there's a church across the street. They set it up, put out tents, put out a microphone. So yes, a lot of support there.
That support and the help of tools gained in counseling and through faith have helped Alan when dealing with less positive interactions. A lot of that, he says, has come from social media. He spent time and effort scouring comments and posts for possible leads and clues. But instead, he found commenters dissecting his family's every move and casting callous judgment. It was painful, especially because his brother Devin had been thrust into the media spotlight to do interviews while still experiencing the initial shock of their mother's brutal murder. And yet, people sitting at home wanted to critique his every expression as he stood in front of the news camera, trying to make sense of her death and to ask the public for help.
There were no clues there. It was just people's perception. I mean, somebody made a comment because my brother was on one news channel. They were like, oh, he must know something because he's smiling. It's I'm like, what? And then somebody else comments well, he's trying to, think happily about his mom. That's ridiculous. So you see the back and forth and, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, why did I even come here for this? But, there are no clues there. Nobody's going to say I did it in the social media comments.
And they have still been waiting for those tips, even with a $30,000 reward in place and the PPD working Rose's case. Recently, all 3 siblings gathered at their childhood home to go through their parents' belongings and to begin to clean it out. Donna said it was painful, but also touching, and a bonding experience that they had needed for a long time.
It needed to happen. I didn't realize that the three of us hadn't been together in our childhood home since the day after my mom's funeral. The best part about it was we took a break on day one and we sat at the dining room table, which is like a big deal in our family. We always ate dinner together. Like my mom had the dinner bell, would ring it. Everybody would stop what they were doing, come downstairs. So we did something similar. We ate at the dining room table, but it was pretty funny because I'm like, okay, are we really going to eat without a tablecloth? And so we started getting nervous and we're like, oh, we could use placemats, but they're dusty. So we could almost like hear my mom saying, don't you spill anything on our table. So when I came downstairs to eat, my brothers had covered the table with like newspaper, just anything so that we didn't mess up the table. But we sat and ate lunch together and we needed that.
Donna has thought a lot about her parents' legacy, and it makes her wish that we, as a society, still functioned more like community, that we cared for the elders who'd taken such care of us. Her mother's case is tied into that.
I just feel like when I was younger, I felt like seniors were respected. If you were on the bus and a senior came by, you were to give up your seat, let them sit down, and you hold on with your book bag and, your art portfolio and your folders, and you let them have that seat because they've earned it. I worry about my neighbors and how they must feel, they may fear for their own safety, and it shouldn't be that. When you have worked hard and paid off your home, you have earned the right to enjoy the fruits of your labor, especially people that have worked so hard for their community, So for this to happen, it's beyond tragic, and we deserve to have the case solved. I would say the first thing for me is to not forget. So I think it's easy for time to sort of go by and move on. And I would love for my mom to have justice so that she can truly rest in peace. From a spiritual standpoint, I'm grateful that my parents are together. So I know and I believe that they're up there dancing. They used to love to dance and do the bop, a dance that I never quite mastered. But I know from a spiritual standpoint, they're together. But to preserve their legacy and all that they stood for and their belief in community and support, to just not forget, to just share anything that we can until the case is solved, and, to make sure that the streets are safe, that they return to being a safe place for everyone.
For Alan, his parents' legacy is also tied into advocacy. Butch and Rose served the community all their lives, and now he's carrying that on too. He'd already worked to help improve the world around him, but now he sees other paths that he can follow too.
So one of the first things you said to me when we got in contact was that you wanted to touch on how this grief and this tragedy in your family has led to advocacy work as well. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for me, I'm a follower of Christ, and I don't really question why this happened, right? Because there's evil people in the world who do evil stuff. Honestly, I think if more people understood that, we would be in a different place. But for me, it's more of, what am I supposed to do with this? Right? So this happened to my mom. We're experiencing this grief. In honor of my parents, how can I serve other people in the midst of this grief? And so for me, it's really focusing in on how men, and in particular Black men, how we handle grief, because we've been socialized to be strong, whatever that means. And so it's been a couple of things, really talking about grief and what it does to you. Grief, it makes you exhausted. It makes you perhaps gain weight. It can give you heart palpitations because of anxiety. It can give you what I call procrastination on steroids. All these things. As a business owner, I would get emails about opportunities, and I would look at the email and I just physically could not answer the email. And initially I was hard on myself, but when I got to therapy, My therapist was really helpful, and it was a grief and trauma therapist. And she really laid out for me how normal that is for someone who's been through a traumatic situation, and not to be hard on myself. And so really just that, but also helping men understand that when you, and anyone, like when you go through a situation like this, or any situation that causes you grief, you become a different person, right? For me, I had to learn how to have fun again. I had to learn how to be around crowds again, even though still don't really like it. I had to really re-examine who the people around me. I had to understand that you're going to lose friends just because you're the person whose mother was killed. Some people don't want to be around somebody who is grieving and who's going through something like this. And then you'll find that other unexpected people will step forward and do like amazing things for you. There's going to be a new normal, and we have to understand that and embrace that. Then the biggest thing for men is that we got to cry. Like you have to, most people feel better after a good cry, and so you have to do that. And we're socialized not to cry, but that's so detrimental to healing that we need to do that. And so that was what I think God is leading me to, the what am I supposed to do with this? I think that's it. Apparently in the Affordable Care Act, there's money to provide lighting and potentially security cameras to businesses. But when I talked to local elected officials in Philadelphia, and actually the state representative as well, was about, using that for neighborhoods that have more elderly population, right? Can they get free ring cameras? Can they get free additional lighting or additional patrol or something to help protect the elders who are likely living alone? How do we get more protection, since we've had a few instances of violence against them? So we started down that path. State Representative McClinton, she's one of the state representatives for Pennsylvania. She came out to the rally that we had. And so I mentioned this Tots and Teens group. Her mom was in that group. And so she actually, as a child, had hung around in our house. And so she's like, so this is, this obviously is a personal case for me, but it's also an example of how the influence that my mom had, her reach in the community, that, that a woman who I never even thought about as far as, being a state rep or anything, was like, yeah, I used to hang around in your house. So those are the things I've been trying to do. And what I found, though, is that I had to wait a bit to do them because, grief was pretty intense early on. And, you're not going to really be able to get a lot done at all. You need some time. You're not going to immediately turn to advocacy, but eventually you kind of find your spot and you kind of lean into it.
Alan also thinks about what it might take to encourage a person of interest to come forward, or another person who has information to share it. And in his mind, it's about seeing humanity in other people. We often connect that to our own experiences with love, our children, our mothers, our fathers. He told us a story from his own childhood that made him consider just that.
I'm going to tell you a story that I didn't really think about this until after my mom's death. I was in kindergarten, so this was probably like 1974, 75. So there's this bank on 58th and Baltimore Avenue, which is like 3 blocks from our home. And my mom would go there. This is back when you had like a passbook, and like you would go into the bank, and like there's like no ATM or anything. You got to go get in line and go up to the window and do your transactions. And so my mom and I walked down there, and when you go into the bank, on the right are all the windows, and then you can see the banker sitting off right in front of the vault that's in the back. And so in front of the bankers are some chairs, and so my mom would have me go sit in the chair while she would go in line in the bank. I look up and I notice that the security guard, so thinking of my 4-5-year-old brain, I'm like, wow, the security guard's friend, he's talking to his friend. And then I looked closer and I saw that the guy had a stocking mask over his face, and he was holding a gun to the security guard. And I was like, oh, that's not a friend. And so another guy comes in with a gun and says, everybody get on the floor. And so I kind of slid down in my chair, and my mom is probably about a good 20 feet away from me in line, and they're all laying down. And so the guy basically says, anybody moves, I'm going to shoot him. And so he's like, one guy has his arm around the security guard's neck, holding a gun to him. The other guy has a gun, and he's telling the teller to put money into a bag. And so my mom looks at me, she makes eye contact with me, and she motions for me to get down the floor and to crawl over to her. And so I slowly start to crawl, but I'm looking at the guy too, because I'm like, he did say he was going to shoot anybody. So, in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, is he going to shoot me? Or is he going to shoot my mom for asking for me? And so when I got halfway to my mom, he looked at me, and then he watched me crawl to my mom, and then he kind of looked away. And so I got to my mom, she hugged me and basically like pulled me under her. And that was my first experience seeing a gun. And my mom protected me because that's what she did. And so I remember that happened, but after my mom was murdered, it resonated with me because I felt like at the time that I thought about this, that I remembered this story, that I wasn't able to protect my mom from a gun, and she protected me. And so that really stuck with me. And I don't feel guilt from it per se, but for me, it kind of really, it says who my mom is, where she was willing to risk herself for me. Even though that guy said, I'll shoot anybody who moves, she was more concerned about protecting me than her. And that's the best story that I can think of that ties in here, that really really encompasses who my mom is. And when I thought about it later, I thought maybe that man had a son, and he looked at me crawling across, was like, that's that mom's son. Like, I'm not going to do what I just said I'm going to do. Maybe there was humanity there. And in the same token, I'm praying that the person who killed my mom has some humanity.
That's why any information from the public will be vital in helping to solve Rose's case. Anyone in the Southwest Philly area who was in the vicinity at the time, in the early morning hours of September 7th or directly afterward, could have information that might be helpful in apprehending Rose's killer. If you observed anything unusual, whether that be activity on the 5700 block of Broomall Street that seemed strange or out of place, or someone fleeing the area, please get in touch with the Philadelphia police and share what you know. If you don't have information, you can still help by sharing the story as widely as possible to attract the attention of people who might have the missing piece that will help bring justice for Rose Goodman. If you have any information in the unsolved homicide of Rose Goodman, please reach out to the Philadelphia Police Department at 215-686-TIPS. There's a $30,000 reward available in her case. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure you're set for automatic downloads so you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere now. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research assistance by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Engineered and scored by Southern Gothic Media and Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.